The Florida Keys basked in their usual serenity on the day Levi Morgan vanished. The calm, turquoise waters, a constant source of inspiration for the marine biologist, seemed to mock the storm brewing beneath the surface of his life. Levi had always been meticulous, the kind of man whose routines were as predictable as the tides. But when his absence stretched into hours, and then into an entire day, the small community of Aspen Heights began to buzz with concern. For someone like Levi, disappearing without a trace was more than unusual. It was alarming. Levi had arranged to meet his estranged wife, Camille Morgan, at the Marine Research Lab where they had once worked together. The lab, nestled along the coast, was a space they had shared long before their marriage began to unravel. What was once a symbol of their shared passion for marine conservation had become a battleground for disputes over funding, equipment, and unresolved grievances. That evening, Levi had intended to settle one last matter, the division of their jointly owned assets. It was supposed to be straightforward, but as the hours passed without word from him, the straightforwardness faded into uncertainty. The first sign that something was amiss came when Levi's car was discovered at a secluded dock not far from the lab. It sat there, keys in the ignition, as though he had intended to return at any moment. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, and a faint trail of footprints led from the dock toward the water before disappearing entirely. His phone, typically a constant companion, was found on the passenger seat, its screen shattered. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like an unfortunate accident. To Detective Ava Green, who was called to the scene, it screamed something far more sinister. The dock, weathered by years of salt spray and harsh sunlight, offered few immediate answers. No one had seen Levi that evening, though it was well known he often used the dock for his fieldwork. Camille, when contacted by investigators, claimed Levi had left their meeting in frustration, insisting she had no idea where he had gone. Her tone was defensive, the kind of defensiveness that made Green's instincts bristle. It wasn't an outright denial, but it was far from cooperative. Inside the research lab, where the couple had spent years working side by side, signs of Levi's meticulousness were everywhere. Charts documenting coral growth adorned the walls, and samples were arranged with the precision only someone like Levi could maintain. But amid the order, subtle signs of disarray began to emerge. The lab's industrial freezer, typically used for preserving marine specimens, had an unnatural smell lingering around it, a mix of bleach and something faintly metallic. The floor near the freezer bore faint scratches, as though something heavy had been dragged across it. As the investigation deepened, Green's team uncovered additional anomalies. Blood traces were found on the lab's floor, faint but unmistakable under the harsh glare of forensic lights. A dive knife, commonly used in their research, was missing from its designated spot. Green couldn't ignore the growing weight of these clues, and all of them pointed back to one person: Camille. In the days that followed, the once quiet Aspen Heights transformed into a hub of speculation. Neighbors whispered about the Morgans' tumultuous relationship, and rumors swirled about the heated arguments overheard in their shared workspace. Darren Hart, a fisherman who lived near the dock, came forward with a statement that added to the puzzle. He claimed to have seen Camille at the dock late that night, her movements hurried, her body language tense. According to Hart, she had struggled with a large, heavy object, loading it onto a small fishing boat before vanishing into the darkness of the water. When questioned about his hesitance to report this earlier, Hart simply muttered, "It just didn't seem right to get involved." As Green pieced together the fragments of Levi's life, a picture began to form, one marred by professional jealousy, financial disputes, and emotional instability. Camille's anxiety disorder, something her close friends had alluded to in interviews, seemed to exacerbate the tension in her life. Her financial struggles, compounded by Levi's success and their impending divorce, painted a portrait of someone teetering on the edge. The discovery of cleaning supplies purchased by Camille shortly before Levi's disappearance raised even more questions. A receipt from a local hardware store showed she had bought industrial bleach, gloves, and sponges. When confronted with this information, her response was evasive, claiming they were for cleaning the lab after a routine maintenance project. But Green knew better than to take such explanations at face value. By the end of the week, the evidence against Camille had begun to stack up. Each clue, from the bloodstains in the lab to the suspicious behavior at the dock, wove a narrative that Green couldn't ignore. Levi's disappearance was no longer a question of where he had gone, but rather of what had happened and who was responsible. As the sun set on Aspen Heights, casting long shadows over the pristine waters, the idyllic facade of the town began to crack, revealing the darkness that lay beneath. This was no accident. This was something far more deliberate. And as Green stared out at the endless expanse of the ocean, she knew the answers she sought were lurking just beneath its surface. Aspen Heights had always been a town where everyone knew everyone else, or so it seemed. The disappearance of Levi Morgan quickly revealed that even in a close-knit community, secrets could lie hidden in plain sight. As Detective Ava Green dove deeper into the case, she realized that understanding Levi and Camille's complex history was the key to unraveling the truth. But the deeper she dug, the more tangled the web became. Levi Morgan had been the golden boy of Aspen Heights. As a marine biologist, he was celebrated for his groundbreaking work on coral reef restoration. His research had brought recognition not only to himself, but also to the small research lab he co-founded with Camille. For years, their partnership had been seen as a perfect blend of intellect and creativity. Levi's scientific rigor complemented Camille's knack for organization and her ability to secure funding. But behind the accolades and the smiles at public events, cracks in their relationship had long been forming. Camille Morgan was, by all appearances, a driven and resourceful woman. She had played a significant role in the lab's success, managing grants and ensuring that Levi's ambitious projects stayed on track. However, interviews with her colleagues and friends painted a different picture. Camille had always struggled with anxiety, a condition she worked hard to hide. Those close to her described moments when the pressure seemed to overwhelm her, times when she would become unusually irritable or withdrawn. Her separation from Levi had only intensified these struggles. The divorce proceedings had been anything but amicable. Camille felt Levi was dismissive of her contributions to the lab, treating her more as an employee than a partner. Financial records uncovered by Green's team revealed the depths of the discord. Levi had recently petitioned to sell the lab's assets, a move that would leave Camille without a stable income. To make matters worse, Camille had been using personal savings to cover operational costs, and her financial situation was rapidly deteriorating. But Levi's life was not without its shadows either. Despite his reputation as a dedicated scientist, there were whispers about his cold, exacting nature. Colleagues described him as brilliant but unyielding, unwilling to compromise or consider ideas that didn't align with his vision. There had also been rumors of an affair, a quiet but persistent narrative that added another layer of complexity to the Morgans' already fraught relationship. As Green sifted through interviews, one name kept resurfacing: Mia Wallace, Camille's best friend since childhood. Mia was fiercely loyal to Camille, often acting as her confidant and emotional anchor. But her loyalty seemed to waver when detectives questioned her. Mia admitted that Camille had been under tremendous stress and had expressed deep resentment toward Levi in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. "She felt trapped," Mia said during one of the interviews. "She told me she couldn't see a way out of the mess they were in." Then there was Darren Hart, the reclusive fisherman who lived near the dock where Levi's car was found. Darren was a man of few words, known around town for his solitary nature. When Green visited his modest home, the smell of salt water and fish was overwhelming. Darren's testimony was both intriguing and frustratingly vague. He admitted to seeing Camille at the dock late at night, but his description of her actions was fragmented. "She looked frantic," Darren said, his weathered face unreadable. "Kept pacing back and forth, like she was trying to make up her mind about something." Darren's observations raised more questions than answers. What had Camille been doing at the dock, and why hadn't she mentioned it during her initial interview? Green was also struck by Darren's reluctance to elaborate. It was as if he knew more than he was letting on, but was hesitant to get involved. "People like to keep their noses clean around here," he muttered before abruptly ending the conversation. The physical evidence, meanwhile, was piling up. Forensic analysis of the lab revealed faint traces of blood on the floor near the industrial freezer. Though the blood had been partially cleaned, advanced techniques confirmed it was Levi's. This discovery was a turning point, solidifying the lab as a critical scene in the investigation. But it also deepened the mystery. If Levi had been injured, or worse, inside the lab, why was his car at the dock? And why had Camille gone to such lengths to clean the area, but left so many subtle traces behind? Adding to the puzzle was the discovery of a discarded glove near the dock. The glove, damp from the morning dew, was sent to the lab for analysis. Fibers from Levi's clothing were found embedded in the material, suggesting physical contact. But what troubled Green the most was the deliberate nature of the cleanup effort. Whoever had staged the scene was methodical but not flawless, a combination that hinted at both panic and calculated intent. The narrative that began to form in Green's mind was one of escalating desperation. Camille's anxiety disorder, combined with the financial and emotional strain of the divorce, seemed to have pushed her to a breaking point. But Green couldn't ignore the possibility of another player in this twisted story. Darren's hesitance, Mia's cryptic statements, and the persistent rumors of Levi's affair all suggested that there was more to uncover. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly fell into place, Green realized the case was far from straightforward. Every lead uncovered a new layer of complexity, and every answer raised another question. The idyllic facade of Aspen Heights was crumbling, revealing a web of secrets, lies, and half-truths that threatened to consume everyone involved. Green knew that solving Levi Morgan's disappearance required more than just connecting the dots. It required delving into the lives of those closest to him, uncovering the motives and emotions that had driven them to this moment. And as she stared at the map of Aspen Heights, marked with pins for every piece of evidence and every witness, she felt the weight of the truth pressing down on her. Somewhere in the tangled web of relationships and rivalries was the key to Levi's fate. But finding it would mean navigating the murky waters of human ambition, fear, and betrayal. The lab was quiet when Detective Ava Green returned, its sterile air carrying a faint hint of bleach that made her stomach tighten. The building, tucked away at the edge of Aspen Heights, stood as both a monument to Levi Morgan's achievements and a silent witness to whatever had unfolded in its shadow. This was where the story began to unravel. The scratches on the floor, the faint stains no cleaner could entirely erase, and the freezer's unnatural chill all pointed to a violent confrontation. Green knew she was standing in the epicenter of the mystery. The industrial freezer dominated the room. Its stainless steel surface gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but its purpose now seemed far removed from the marine specimens it had been designed to preserve. Forensic analysts had already identified traces of blood on the floor around the freezer, evidence of a hurried cleanup that failed to mask its chilling reality. The blood had been partially diluted with cleaning agents, but chemical testing confirmed it belonged to Levi Morgan. Near the freezer, faint gouges marked the polished concrete floor. They formed an uneven trail, as though something heavy had been dragged from one end of the room to another. The marks stopped abruptly at the freezer, their jagged edges telling a story of effort and desperation. Green's mind filled with grim possibilities. Whatever had been moved, it had been done in a hurry, and Levi's blood on the floor suggested he hadn't walked away from this room. Further inspection of the lab revealed more unsettling details. A single dive knife, part of the standard equipment used in marine research, was missing from its designated slot on the tool rack. The rack itself was pristine, its tools arranged with almost obsessive precision. This discrepancy caught Green's attention immediately. Levi was known for his meticulous habits, and the absence of the knife felt like a deliberate gap in an otherwise perfect order. Another troubling discovery came in the form of cleaning supplies. A bottle of industrial bleach sat half-empty under the sink, alongside a pair of yellow rubber gloves. Both items were submitted for forensic analysis, and preliminary results indicated the presence of bloodstains on the gloves. Whoever had used them had made an effort to clean, but the stains clung stubbornly to the material, another piece of evidence pointing toward a frantic cover-up. Outside the lab, near the dock where Levi's car was found, Green's team uncovered a discarded cooler. The cooler was coated in salt residue, its latches rusted from exposure to seawater. Inside, forensic investigators found traces of biological material, fibers matching the clothing Levi had been wearing on the day he disappeared. The cooler's dimensions were unnervingly precise, large enough to hold a human body, yet small enough to be transported discreetly. One of the most significant discoveries came from the surrounding environment. Near the dock, embedded in the wet sand, lay a single rubber glove. The glove was torn, its edges frayed as though caught on something sharp. Inside, investigators found fibers consistent with Levi's jacket, along with a mix of DNA from both Levi and Camille. This find further connected Camille to the dock and suggested physical contact had occurred there. The dive knife, which had initially been thought missing, was later retrieved from a shallow cove not far from the dock. Its blade bore traces of Levi's blood, along with faint fingerprints belonging to Camille. This discovery solidified the lab and the dock as two critical locations in the timeline of Levi's disappearance. Darren Hart's earlier statement about Camille's presence at the dock added weight to the growing pile of evidence. His testimony described her movements as erratic, her attempts to maneuver the heavy cooler clumsy and desperate. He mentioned hearing the faint clatter of metal against the boat as she loaded her cargo, a sound that now made sense in the context of the dive knife and the cooler. Camille's behavior during her interviews with law enforcement only deepened Green's suspicions. When confronted with the evidence, she faltered, her explanations shifting with each new question. She admitted to being at the lab and the dock on the night of Levi's disappearance, but claimed her actions were unrelated to any wrongdoing. "I was cleaning up," she insisted, her voice tight and defensive. "Levi left after our argument. I don't know where he went." But Green wasn't convinced. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to align, and every thread pointed back to the same conclusion. Whatever happened to Levi Morgan had been deliberate, calculated, and carried out in the very spaces where he had once felt most at home. The lab, the dock, the cooler, and the knife formed a haunting tableau, each element tied together by the single undeniable truth: Levi had never left Aspen Heights alive. As Green stood in the lab, the weight of the case pressed down on her. The evidence told a story, but there were still gaps, moments of uncertainty that needed to be filled. Camille's motive, the exact sequence of events, and the role of others like Mia Wallace and Darren Hart remained unclear. But one thing was certain: this was no simple disappearance. Levi Morgan's life had ended in violence, and the answers lay just beneath the surface of the evidence. Green was determined to bring them to light. Detective Ava Green had been part of countless investigations, but this one felt different. Levi Morgan's disappearance wasn't just a case of a man vanishing. It was an intricate puzzle, and every piece seemed deliberately misplaced. The deeper Green delved, the more the mystery unraveled into something darker, more calculated. The evidence pointed in conflicting directions, and the web of lies woven around Levi's final moments only grew tighter. The forensic evidence from the lab and the dock had provided a starting point, but the unanswered questions loomed large. What exactly had happened on the night Levi disappeared? Why had Camille cleaned the lab so meticulously, yet failed to cover all her tracks? And what role did Darren Hart, the fisherman with a penchant for keeping his head down, play in this story? Green decided to focus on Camille first. The estranged wife's actions were erratic at best, suspicious at worst. Camille's financial troubles had been well documented, and her anxiety disorder, though not an excuse, painted a picture of a woman teetering on the edge. Camille's alibi had already started to crumble under scrutiny. She claimed to have been working late at the lab cataloging inventory, but security logs showed she logged out hours before Levi's car was found at the dock. Her phone records placed her near the dock during the critical hours, contradicting her assertion that she had been nowhere near the area. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Camille's responses wavered. Her hands trembled as she spoke, and her voice faltered under Green's piercing gaze. "I told you," she insisted, her tone defensive. "Levi left after our argument. I don't know where he went." But the evidence told a different story. Blood traces in the lab, drag marks near the industrial freezer, and the dive knife bearing both Levi's blood and Camille's fingerprints were damning. Yet Camille clung to her denial, her anxiety spiraling into visible panic with every question. Green wasn't convinced that Camille had acted alone, even if she was involved. The pieces didn't fit neatly together. Darren Hart's testimony weighed heavily on her mind. The fisherman had described Camille's frantic movements at the dock, but had been frustratingly vague about what he had seen. He mentioned a large cooler being loaded onto a small boat, but claimed he hadn't thought much of it at the time. Green couldn't shake the feeling that Darren was holding something back, either out of fear or misplaced loyalty. To complicate matters, Mia Wallace, Camille's longtime friend, was also becoming a person of interest. During her initial interviews, Mia had been careful with her words, painting Camille as a woman overwhelmed by her circumstances but incapable of violence. However, Green noticed subtle contradictions in Mia's statements. In one breath, she claimed Camille had confided in her about the financial strain Levi had caused, but in another, she insisted their conversations had been normal in the days leading up to his disappearance. When pressed, Mia admitted that Camille had been acting strange but refused to elaborate. The breakthrough came when Green's team uncovered surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. The footage showed Camille purchasing cleaning supplies late on the night of Levi's disappearance. She was alone, her expression tight with determination. The timestamp placed her near the dock an hour before Darren Hart claimed to have seen her. This revelation added another layer to the timeline and cast further doubt on Camille's version of events. Green decided it was time to bring Darren in for another round of questioning. The fisherman's reluctance to get involved had frustrated her from the beginning, but she sensed he knew more than he let on. Darren's second interview was tense. He fidgeted with the brim of his hat, avoiding eye contact as Green pressed him for details. "I told you what I saw," he muttered, his voice gruff. "She was there, messing with that boat. That's all." But Green wasn't satisfied. "You mentioned hearing something that night," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "What was it, Darren? What did you hear?" Darren hesitated, his fingers tightening around the hat. "It sounded like metal scraping, like something heavy being dragged. And then, after that, there was this splash. It wasn't loud, but you could hear it clear enough." The mention of the splash sent a chill through Green. The image of the cooler, coated in salt residue and containing fibers from Levi's clothing, flashed in her mind. The dock, the boat, the splash. It all pointed to a grim conclusion. Green's team continued piecing together the fragmented timeline. They found additional evidence linking Camille to the lab and the dock that night. Her car's tires had traces of sand matching the dock's composition, and her shoes bore saltwater residue. Forensic analysis of the cooler confirmed the presence of Levi's biological material, though the exact cause of his death remained unclear. The dive knife retrieved from the shallow cove was the most significant piece of evidence. Its blade, stained with Levi's blood, painted a grim picture of violence. As the investigation progressed, Green couldn't ignore the psychological aspects of the case. Camille's anxiety disorder and financial desperation were clear motivators, but her behavior suggested more than just impulsive panic. The methodical cleanup of the lab, the deliberate disposal of evidence, and her evasive responses all hinted at premeditation. Yet there were still gaps, moments in the timeline that didn't add up. Green turned her attention back to the larger picture. Levi's life, though seemingly perfect, had its own shadows. Rumors of an affair had surfaced early in the investigation, and Green couldn't dismiss them entirely. If Levi had been unfaithful, it could have added another layer of tension to his already volatile relationship with Camille. But proving the existence of an affair required more than hearsay. As the sun set over Aspen Heights, casting long shadows over the tranquil waters, Green felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. The evidence was mounting, but the truth remained elusive. Each lead brought her closer to understanding what had happened to Levi Morgan, but the final pieces of the puzzle were still out of reach. Somewhere in the tangled web of lies, secrets, and desperation lay the answer. Green was determined to find it, no matter how deep she had to dig. The air inside the Aspen Heights Police Department felt heavier as the investigation deepened. Detective Ava Green meticulously reviewed the growing list of evidence, each piece adding to the portrait of a crime both deliberate and desperate. Yet the final image remained frustratingly incomplete. To uncover the truth behind Levi Morgan's disappearance, Green needed to dig deeper into the lives of those closest to him, while carefully unraveling the complex web of lies surrounding Camille Morgan. The dive knife, retrieved from the shallow cove, was a pivotal discovery. Forensic analysts confirmed traces of Levi's blood on the blade and Camille's fingerprints on the handle. The implications were damning, but the lack of a clear motive and sequence of events still left room for doubt. Green's gut told her there was more to this story than a single act of violence. Green decided to revisit the lab, where the faint marks on the floor had lingered in her mind. A closer examination revealed small metallic fragments embedded in the grooves, possibly from the knife or another sharp object. The marks reinforced the theory that something heavy had been dragged across the floor. Levi's blood had been found here, but no signs of a prolonged struggle. The attack had likely been quick and efficient, yet the killer had taken time to clean the area thoroughly, leaving only faint traces behind. Meanwhile, the analysis of Camille's SUV added another layer of intrigue. Inside the trunk, forensic teams found carpet fibers matching the lab's industrial flooring, along with faint traces of blood. Saltwater residue on the vehicle's tires further confirmed Camille had driven to the dock that night. Combined with Darren Hart's testimony about her suspicious activity, the evidence painted a timeline. Levi had been injured or killed at the lab, transported to the dock, and disposed of in the water. But Green was not one to rely solely on circumstantial evidence. She instructed her team to scour Levi's financial records, emails, and phone logs for anything that might provide additional context. The search yielded an unexpected lead: an email from Levi to an unknown recipient sent just days before his disappearance. The subject line read, "Need to talk. Urgent." The message itself was vague, but hinted at Levi's growing concerns about someone close to him. Green wondered if Levi had been aware of the danger he faced. The investigation also took a closer look at Camille's mental health history. Her untreated anxiety disorder, while not an excuse for violence, provided insight into her increasingly erratic behavior. Friends and colleagues described a woman under immense pressure, oscillating between moments of composure and episodes of agitation. Mia Wallace, Camille's longtime confidant, reluctantly admitted that Camille had expressed a desire to end the madness in the days leading up to Levi's disappearance. When asked what she meant, Mia hesitated. She said she felt like she was being pushed into a corner, Mia explained, like she didn't have a choice anymore. Green couldn't ignore the possibility that Camille's actions were a culmination of years of emotional turmoil and mounting stress. But there was still the matter of the gas station surveillance footage. Camille had purchased cleaning supplies late that night, bleach gloves and trash bags. The footage showed her moving quickly, her expression tense. Green replayed the video several times, noting how Camille avoided eye contact with the cashier, her shoulders hunched as though carrying an invisible weight. The pressure of the case began to take its toll on Camille during questioning. In her latest interrogation, she seemed more fragmented, her explanations less cohesive. When asked about the blood in her car and the dive knife, she stammered, I don't know how it got there. Maybe Levi, maybe he used it for something." Her inability to provide a consistent story only strengthened Green's resolve to uncover the truth. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when Green's team discovered an unregistered fishing boat tied to a dock miles from Aspen Heights. The boat, linked to Darren Hart, contained traces of salt and biological material consistent with the cooler found earlier. Darren had initially denied owning any vessel beyond his small dinghy, but the discovery forced Green to bring him in for further questioning. Darren's demeanor shifted during the interrogation. No longer the quiet, unassuming fisherman, he became defensive and agitated. "I don't know what you're talking about," he insisted, his voice rising. "I didn't do anything wrong." But Green knew better. The boat was the missing piece connecting Darren to Camille's late-night activity. Whether he had acted as an accomplice or had simply looked the other way remained to be seen. As the pieces began to fall into place, Green found herself drawn back to one detail she couldn't shake: Levi's email. Who had he been trying to contact and why? Green authorized a deeper dive into Levi's digital communications, hoping to uncover the recipient's identity. The answer came in the form of a private server, registered under an alias, that Levi had used for sensitive conversations. Among the recovered emails was a series of messages exchanged with someone referred to only as AW. The messages hinted at a secret Levi had been keeping, something that could potentially ruin his reputation if exposed. The introduction of this mysterious third party added a new layer of complexity to the case. Was AW someone Levi had trusted or someone who had turned against him? And how did their involvement intersect with Camille's increasingly suspicious behavior? Green couldn't ignore the possibility that this unknown figure might hold the key to understanding what truly happened to Levi Morgan. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of the investigation bore down on Green and her team. The evidence was damning but incomplete, the motives murky but compelling. Levi's disappearance was no longer just a case, it was a collision of desperation, betrayal, and secrets too dangerous to remain hidden. Green knew the answers were within reach, but uncovering them would require peeling back the layers of deception that had shielded the truth for far too long. The investigation into Levi Morgan's disappearance had reached a fever pitch. Each new discovery revealed not only more about the crime, but also the layers of deceit surrounding the lives of those closest to him. Detective Ava Green felt the weight of the case with every step, her mind piecing together fragments of evidence like a puzzle that refused to complete itself. Now, as the pressure mounted, the investigation took a darker and more twisted turn. Green's team had spent days analyzing the recovered emails between Levi and the enigmatic AW. While the identity of AW remained elusive, the messages hinted at a significant dispute over funding and intellectual property related to Levi's research. One email read, "You don't understand what this could do to me. If this gets out, I lose everything." Another simply stated, "Meet me at the lab. We need to settle this before it's too late." The timing of these messages, sent just hours before Levi's disappearance, suggested a clandestine meeting that might have escalated into violence. Meanwhile, Darren Hart's involvement became increasingly suspect. Forensic analysis of the unregistered fishing boat linked to him revealed more than just salt and biological traces. Investigators discovered fibers consistent with Levi's jacket embedded in the boat's storage compartment, along with a faint smudge of blood. When confronted, Darren's demeanor shifted from defensive to combative. "I told you everything I know," he snapped during his latest interview. But Green knew he was lying. His account of seeing Camille at the dock now seemed carefully constructed, as though he was deflecting attention from his own actions. Adding to the intrigue was the re-examination of Camille's finances. Green's team uncovered irregularities in the research lab's funding records. It appeared that Camille had been redirecting small amounts of grant money into personal accounts for months, likely as a way to offset her mounting debts. Levi's discovery of this financial mismanagement might have been the catalyst for their final confrontation, but Camille's actions alone didn't explain the meticulous planning evident in the disposal of Levi's body. Green couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been involved, someone who had both motive and means. The breakthrough came when a search of Darren Hart's property revealed a hidden compartment in his garage. Inside, detectives found a pair of boots encrusted with dried mud and sand that matched the composition of the dock where Levi's car was found. More chillingly, they uncovered a set of blueprints for a small fishing boat, annotated with notes about weight distribution and modifications to its storage capacity. The discovery raised alarming questions. Had Darren been complicit in transporting Levi's body, or had he orchestrated the entire operation? Green returned to Camille for another round of questioning. This time, the weight of the evidence seemed to break her. She admitted to arguing with Levi at the lab, her voice trembling as she described the escalating tension. "He told me everything was my fault," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "The debt, the lab, the divorce, it was all on me. I snapped, okay? But I didn't mean to. I didn't mean for it to go that far." Her admission was damning, but it still didn't explain Darren's involvement or the extent of her planning. As the pieces fell into place, Green realized she had missed something critical. She revisited the surveillance footage from the gas station and noticed a detail that had initially seemed insignificant. Camille wasn't alone when she purchased the cleaning supplies. A shadowy figure, partially obscured by the camera angle, stood at the edge of the frame. The figure's height and build matched Darren's, and further analysis confirmed he had been present during the transaction. This revelation linked Darren and Camille more closely than ever before, suggesting a conspiracy rather than a solitary crime. The final twist came from an unexpected source. A routine check of Levi's phone records revealed a call placed to an unregistered number shortly before his disappearance. The number was traced to a burner phone found in Darren's possession. When questioned, Darren finally broke under the pressure. She begged me to help, he muttered, his voice filled with a mix of defiance and regret. Said she couldn't do it alone. I thought we were just going to scare him. I didn't know, Sheeta, that it'd go this far. Darren's confession painted a grim picture. He and Camille had conspired to confront Levi at the lab, intending to intimidate him into relinquishing his claims over the lab's assets. But the confrontation spiraled out of control. Camille, consumed by rage and panic, had attacked Levi with the dive knife. Darren, realizing the severity of the situation, had reluctantly agreed to help her dispose of the body. Together, they had transported Levi's remains to the dock, loaded the cooler onto Darren's fishing boat, and dumped it into the ocean under the cover of darkness. Green felt a mix of relief and frustration as the full story emerged. The case had become more convoluted than she ever anticipated, with layers of betrayal and desperation that defied simple explanations. Camille's actions were rooted in years of anxiety and financial strain, while Darren's involvement stemmed from misplaced loyalty and fear. Together, their choices had led to a tragedy that would haunt Aspen Heights for years to come. As Green prepared to present the case to the district attorney, she couldn't help but reflect on the human cost of Levi Morgan's disappearance. The evidence had finally revealed the truth, but the scars left behind would linger far longer than the headlines. For Camille, Darren, and the community that once celebrated Levi's brilliance, there would be no easy closure, only the enduring weight of what had been lost. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, Detective Ava Green knew the time had come to confront Camille Morgan with the full weight of the evidence. The missing dive knife, the blood in the lab, the traces of Levi's biological material in the cooler, and Darren Hart's partial confession. Everything pointed to a planned cover-up born from desperation and fear. Green had seen it all before. People pushed to their limits often made choices they could never take back. Camille sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, her fingers trembling against the table. Her anxiety was palpable, her breathing shallow and uneven. She avoided Green's gaze, focusing instead on the blank wall as if trying to escape the inevitable. Her once polished demeanor had eroded, replaced by an exhaustion that ran deeper than physical fatigue. The carefully constructed lies she had told were beginning to unravel, and she seemed to know it. Green began slowly, laying out the evidence piece by piece. Camille, we found Levi's blood in the lab and in your car. We've matched the knife to both you and Levi. We know you were at the dock, and we know Darren helped you move the cooler. These aren't coincidences. They're facts. Camille flinched at the mention of Darren's name. It was the first sign of a crack in her resolve. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to hurt him. Then tell me what happened, Green pressed, her tone firm but measured. Help me understand. Camille's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. She took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to speak. It started with the argument, she began, her voice shaky. He came to the lab that night, and we were supposed to discuss the financial settlement. But he was so cold. He kept saying everything was my fault. The debt, the divorce, even the lab falling apart. I felt like I was drowning, and he was just standing there watching me struggle. Her voice broke, and she paused to steady herself. I told him I couldn't lose the lab. It's all I had left. But he didn't care. He said he was going to sell it anyway. I couldn't take it. I snapped. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what they implied. Green leaned forward, her expression unreadable. What did you do, Camille? I grabbed the knife, Camille admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think. I just reacted. He tried to leave and I panicked. I stabbed him. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she broke into tears. I didn't mean to kill him. I swear I didn't. Green let the silence stretch, allowing Camille's confession to sink in. After that, she prompted gently, what happened next? Camille hesitated, her breath hitching as she struggled to continue. He was on the floor, bleeding. I didn't know what to do. I kept thinking someone would walk in, that I'd lose everything. So I cleaned up the blood, dragged him to the freezer, and I called Darren. Green's stomach turned at the mention of Darren's name. Why Darren? She asked. Why involve him? I didn't have a choice, Camille said, her voice laced with desperation. He was the only person I could trust. I told him it was an accident, that I needed his help to fix it. He didn't want to, but I begged him. I told him I'd take care of everything if he just helped me move Levi. According to Camille, Darren had reluctantly agreed to meet her at the dock. Together, they loaded Levi's body into the cooler, transported it to Darren's unregistered fishing boat, and sailed out into the dark waters of the Florida Keys. Camille described the moment they pushed the cooler overboard, her voice trembling as she recalled the sound of it hitting the water. "It just sank," she said, her tone hollow. I thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't the end. The evidence left behind, traces of blood, fibers, surveillance footage, had unraveled Camille's plan piece by piece. And now her confession solidified the case against her. Green remained silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of Camille's words. "You had other options, Camille," she said finally. "You could have walked away, called for help, but you chose to cover it up." Camille nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know I made it worse. I didn't know what else to do." The interview ended shortly after, and Camille was formally charged with second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Darren, whose involvement had been critical to disposing of Levi's body, faced charges of accessory to murder and tampering with evidence. Both would stand trial for their roles in Levi's death. As Green watched Camille being escorted back to her cell, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy, despite the horrors of what had transpired. Camille wasn't a monster. She was a woman driven to the edge by fear, desperation, and a string of bad decisions. But sympathy couldn't erase the consequences of her actions. Levi Morgan was gone, and the lives of everyone involved had been irrevocably changed. For Green, the case wasn't just about solving a crime. It was a stark reminder of how fragile human lives could be, how quickly a moment of panic could spiral into something far more devastating. As she prepared her final report, she resolved to ensure that Levi's story wouldn't be forgotten, even as the headlines faded and the community moved on. As the trial of Camille Morgan and Darren Hart drew to a close, Aspen Heights struggled to reconcile the idyllic life it once knew with the dark truths revealed during the investigation. The courtroom was packed with residents, reporters, and those who had worked alongside Levi Morgan, all seeking closure for the man whose brilliance had been extinguished far too soon. Camille's confession played a pivotal role in her conviction. The jury, though moved by her evident remorse and the details of her anxiety disorder, could not overlook the calculated efforts she had taken to cover up her actions. Her decision to involve Darren in the disposal of Levi's body demonstrated a level of intent that undermined any claims of pure accident or panic. She was found guilty of second-degree murder and obstruction of justice, receiving a sentence of 25 years to life. Darren, whose complicity had been critical in concealing the crime, was convicted of being an accessory to murder and tampering with evidence, earning him a 10-year sentence. The aftermath of the trial left the community grappling with the weight of the tragedy. Levi's colleagues at the lab mourned not only the loss of a dedicated scientist, but also the collapse of the shared vision they had worked so hard to achieve. The lab, once a hub of innovation, now stood as a grim reminder of the events that had unfolded. Funding for ongoing projects was withdrawn, and the research center eventually closed, leaving a void in the scientific community. Detective Ava Green reflected on the case as she finalized her reports. It had been one of the most challenging investigations of her career, not because of the complexity of the evidence, but because of the human emotions interwoven into every aspect of the crime. Levi's death wasn't just the result of a violent act. It was the culmination of years of unresolved tension, emotional instability, and fear. Camille's story was one of desperation, a slow unraveling under the weight of financial strain and mental health struggles. Darren's involvement spoke to the dangers of misplaced loyalty and the ease with which good intentions could be twisted into complicity. Green found herself returning to a single question: could this tragedy have been prevented? The answer was as murky as the waters where Levi's body had been discarded. Better mental health support for Camille might have helped her cope with her anxiety and the stress of the divorce. Mediation, rather than confrontation, could have de-escalated the dispute between Levi and Camille. But hindsight couldn't change what had already occurred. The case served as a somber reminder of the consequences of ignoring the warning signs in strained relationships. It highlighted the importance of communication, empathy, and seeking help before emotions spiral out of control. Camille's untreated anxiety, coupled with Levi's unyielding demeanor and the lack of external intervention, created a volatile situation that ultimately exploded in violence. As Green addressed the media for the final time, she chose her words carefully, knowing the story would resonate far beyond Aspen Heights. This case isn't just about the loss of a brilliant man or the mistakes of a desperate woman, she said. It's a lesson about the fragility of our relationships, the importance of addressing mental health, and the consequences of letting fear and pride dictate our actions. Levi Morgan deserved better. So did Camille. So did everyone touched by this tragedy. The legacy of Levi's life and work lived on in small but meaningful ways. His colleagues continued their conservation efforts in other labs, dedicating their projects to his memory. The tragedy also sparked a local initiative to provide mental health resources for residents of Aspen Heights, ensuring that others would have access to the help Camille never sought. For Camille and Darren, the weight of their choices would remain with them for the rest of their lives. For the town of Aspen Heights, Levi's death became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fine line between conflict and catastrophe. In the end, the story of Levi Morgan wasn't just a story of loss, it was a call to action, a plea to listen, to empathize, and to intervene when the cracks in someone's life start to show. Because sometimes the smallest actions can prevent the greatest tragedies. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories. Don't miss tomorrow's case where everything will be revealed.